Good morning and welcome to our morning devotions. We're going through the book A View from the Zoo by Gary Richmond. He was a guy that worked at the LA Zoo in the 60s and 70s. Today's chapter is called Badal, and it comes with a picture, even though that's not Badal that's being talked about, just so you know. There are some men who are larger than life. Jack Badal is such a man. I remember my first day as a new keeper at the Los Angeles Zoo. I was introduced to the chief keeper, who in turn introduced me to one of his principal keepers. The principal keeper was responsible for one half of the zoo's animal care and would that day introduce me to my senior keeper. Seniors are in charge of the sections of exhibits, and keepers are in charge of what we call a string. The principal took a moment to size me up and began his introductory speech. Richmond, there's a right way and a wrong way, and Jack Badal's way to do everything, but only Jack can do it his way, so you just work on getting it right. Sensing that he had shared something important, I seized the opportunity to insert the question, who is Jack Badal? Jack works African hoofstock just up the road. If you see a man that wears green baseball cap backwards, whistles while he works, and looks like he could have eaten a Sherman tank for breakfast, that is Jack Badal. He is a real particular about who he talks to, and if he doesn't like you, he won't talk to you at all. He knows more about anyone here and works harder, too. Sounds like an interesting guy. I'll be looking forward to meeting him, I said with enthusiasm. Amazing is a better word, I think, added the principal. And by the way, don't bother asking him any questions about the animals. He won't answer them anyway. Why not? Jack is from a different era. He's from the old school, and the school of trade secrets. In the old days, the keepers were divided into two groups, zookeepers and animal men. The zookeepers basically cleaned and fed wild animals. The animal men turned zookeeping into an art. The animal men knew what their animals were thinking, what they were feeling, and they knew what to do to keep them from fighting and from becoming diseased. And they knew how to encourage breeding, but they wouldn't pass their knowledge on because their knowledge was their job security. It was valuable, not to be given away just because someone asked for it. Your knowledge has been obtained through their knowledge had been obtained through careful observation over a long period of time. So why should they give it away? I was assigned to the Eurasian section of the opposite side of the zoo from the African hoofstock. I didn't see Jack Badal for 3 weeks, but I heard about him often. When people spoke about Jack, it was usually with awe bordering on reverence. And all the veteran keepers from the old Griffith Park Zoo had Badal stories. I remember hearing that he had single-handedly moved an adult ostrich into a crate for shipment after 4 men had failed in their joint attempt. I heard that Jack leaped off a 7-foot wall and subdued a young buffalo so that the zoo vet could give it antibiotics. One of my favorite stories that circulated for all 7 years of my career concerned a strong disagreement. Jack had it with another keeper who had lied about him, causing him to be accused of something he hadn't done. When Jack confronted him, the man was flippant and smart-mouthed. It apparently angered Jack so that he clenched his fists and considered taking a poke at the sarcastic troublemaker. The man knew he had stepped over a foolish line and looked terrified as Jack stood there shaking with anger. Jack had reached a point that required the release of inner tensions, so he hit the wall right next to the man's head. They say his fist passed through the wall into the next room. Jack stared into the shaken man's eyes for a moment and then left the room. I'm not sure whether the stories were true or false. Perhaps they were half true. What was true was that Jack was a legend, and people are always adding to legends. Everyone agreed that Jack was our zoo's only animal man, maybe even the last animal man around. 2 years into my career, I was assigned to be Jack's relief keeper, which meant that I would take care of Jack's string on his days off. I found my heart beating rapidly when my new senior keeper introduced me to Jack as his new relief man. When the senior keeper left, Jack broke the ice by asking, "Do you like African hoofstock?" "I'm not sure. I've never worked with them before." I want to learn everything I can while I'm at the zoo. I will be working with you. I hear you're the best. Most of the guys think you're a legend. Jack smiled and said, Well, you know what they say. A legend's feet are made of sand. I knew right away I was going to enjoy working with Jack. The man turned out to be twice as good as the legend. Follow me, he said as he led me to the sable antelope barn. Before we entered the barn, he paused quietly at the fence and studied every one of the perfect specimens. His eyes searched quickly for anything that would tip him off to a need or problem. His animals were thriving. Their coats shone in the morning sun, and they held their heads proudly. Their eyes had a special sparkle, and their muscles rippled with energy. These antelope were neither too fat nor too thin, and their condition was the result of perfect care. These sables are really something, he said with quiet admiration. The males have been known to kill lions. See the fence? He pointed to the gate. It was bowed out as if it had been hit by a car. That's where the bull hit the other day trying to get to a passerby. We don't go in with those guys. I was glad. Jack looked at me to make sure that I was listening. I nodded that I understood, not to go in with those majestic creations with deadly horns. I had heard that Jack's barns were so immaculate you could eat your lunch off the floors. I'm sure the statement was true, but I never found the will to test it. He opened the door for my first look, and I stepped inside. My eyes searched every corner, especially the stalls. After what he said about the sable antelope, I wanted to be sure that we wouldn't be entering an area that was already occupied. All the animals were outside the barn on exhibit. My inspection ended with my eye-to-eye contact with Jack. He had been watching me. You have the eyes of an animal man, he said. Why do you say that? I asked. When you come into the barn, you looked into every corner to see what was happening. That's what an animal man does. An animal man doesn't miss a thing. He checks everything out. You're going to do good if you stick with this business. I counted that as the greatest compliment that I had received at the zoo. Coming from Jack, those were most encouraging words. Jack trained me for 2 days, and I can honestly say that I learned more that had practical value in those 16 hours than I had learned in the previous 2 years at the zoo. Jack had turned little things into an art. Raking, for instance, became a subject for learning. He showed me how to position the angle of the rake for greater efficiency. I was able to cut my raking time in half. He showed me a technique for tossing dirt back through the rake tines while retaining the leaves and waste material. He showed me how to sculpture the yard to improve rain drainage. He packed the dirt down firmly and kept it from being dusty with frequent waterings. The end result was animals with clear lungs and hooves that seemed to wear down at just the perfect rate. I can't recall our ever needing to trim the hooves of any animal on Jack's string. Jack taught me to whistle while I worked. I felt like a dwarf now and then, but my animals never needed to watch out for me if they could hear where in the exhibit I was. This practice really did relieve tension. Jack showed me a way to moisten the hay so it was more enjoyable for the animals. He also showed me how to place the hay in different locations so that competition for food was reduced. I found Jack to be colorful, knowledgeable, and a great storyteller. Efficient, the hardest worker I had ever met, and a dedicated Christian. I asked Jack to explain his philosophy of animal keeping. His answers were thought-provoking. He said, Gary, I try to spend each day at the zoo so that I never regret yesterday. These animals provide a job for me. The pay I get feeds my family. I figure I owe them the best I can give. It's my job to take all the bad things out of their world and replace them with good things. They depend on me, and I don't want to let them down. Proverbs 12:10 always comes to mind when I think of Jack. A righteous man has regard for the life of his beast. Jack was a living proverb. I did and still do consider Jack Badal the best in the business, the last of the great animal men. Jack's skills were not limited to animal care. He was also one of the greatest animal trainers in history. He trained elephants for the zoo and was especially fond of a lowland gorilla named Ramar. That gorilla performed tricks Gorillas had never been taught before. Jack loved that animal, and his eyes sparkled whenever I asked him about Ramar. The day that Ramar became too large to be safely controlled came all too soon. I know that it broke Jack's heart to give him up to an eastern zoo, but it had to be done. One of my favorite stories is one that Jack told me about how he became the trainer for the Los Angeles Zoo. They needed someone to train the elephants and walk the 2 miles to the new zoo. 3 men applied. Gary, they brought the 3 of us candidates into a waiting room and told us to please sit down. Animal trainers are a funny breed, and we didn't talk much while we were waiting for our turn to be interviewed. They called the first guy in, and about 2 minutes later we heard a macaw squawking its head off. In another 2 minutes the first guy comes out. He's red-faced and doesn't say a word. He just leaves in a huff. The second guy goes in and the same thing happens, only the bird is even louder than before. Number 2 comes out, shaking his head, looks at me, rolls his eyes, and leaves. I wonder what was going on. Mr. Badal, would you please come in? Asked one of the interviewers. I said, yes, sir. And I walked right into the room, and there were some important men from City Hall and the zoo directors, of course. Right in the middle of the room was a large cage with a very nervous scarlet macaw. He was looking at everybody and rocking back and forth because he was still very upset. The director said, so you want to be our trainer, Mr. Badal? Yes, sir, I answered. We would like you to get a little idea of your skills, Mr. Badal. They handed me a small bird net with about 2-foot handle and asked me if I would please take the macaw out of the cage for them. I knew just what had been happening. The 2 guys ahead of me were manhandling the bird. They had most likely netted the bird, drug him out of the cage, and put him back in. That's why the bird was so upset. I hid the net behind me, my back, and spoke quietly to the bird until I could see that it was calming down. Then I slowly and carefully opened the door and let him get used to that. I turned the net around and offered the handle to the bird. He stepped right on, and I lifted him out of the cage slowly and stood before the interview board. I said, now, what would you like me to do with the bird? Put him back in the cage, Mr. Badal, and congratulations, you are our new trainer. In Jack's world, he is the standard of excellence. Admired by his peers and respected by his friends, he is the kind of person about whom it is said, they don't make them like that anymore. As great as all his accomplishments in the animal world were, they were excelled by his quality of walk with Jesus Christ. You see, Jack lives his life according to Colossians 3:17. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And that's today's devotional. If you have any comments that you'd like to leave, maybe something that this chapter meant to you, please leave them in the comments below, and we will see you tomorrow.